So I'd like to turn this over now to Brian Byrd. He's a physician scientist and an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. He's been interested for a number of years in ways to recognize and incentivize ethical data sharing. And we'd like to hear his perspective on data sharing metrics and how we should be thinking about that as a community. So, Brian.
Thank you very much, Warren. And I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to speak today. I hope everybody can hear me and see me okay.
Sounds great.
Okay, terrific. So, as Warren said, I've been invited to present a community perspective. I think the challenge in presenting a community perspective is that I'm an individual, and so I have a certain perspective on things, and it can't be as broad and wide as the research community. People have different considerations, but I certainly have spent a number of years thinking about this as part of what I think about and talking about it with many different stakeholders in the research community. And but I want to give you a little bit more of a sense of the perspective that I have and how it was formed, so that you understand a little bit about that slice of the research community that I represent. So next slide, please. So I am a physician scientist. I have been interested in early proof of concept clinical trials with a focus on pharmacodynamic biomarkers. I've also published observational studies. And the studies that I've published involve both generation of data by me and colleagues, as well as obtaining data from other groups, either through some sort of one-off agreement or through publicly available data sharing. And have had a chance to publish papers also that use both data that I and my colleagues have generated and publicly available data. And to summarize my feelings about this, I have the highest regard for both generating data as well as analyzing data that others have generated. It's very clear to me that both of these activities are absolutely crucial for us to get the most value out of research data that are available at this time. Ask for the next slide, please. I'm also the founder of the Research Symbiont Awards. These are awards for recognizing excellence in data sharing. And some of the comments that I will share today are informed by the process of thinking about what an award for data sharing should look for. What are the criteria that we should use? So I have written criteria that I think have been valuable and important in recognizing people who have data sharing excellence, and I will show you some case studies, actually. And it also has informed my views more generally as well as for this webinar. So the researchsymbionts.org URL is where you can read more about that those awards if you'd like. Next slide, please. Let's review for a moment the current situation in terms of data sharing arrangements. I would describe them as diverse, but it's possible to categorize them, in my opinion. For an upcoming publication, some colleagues and I have thought about ways to think about data sharing arrangements. On the left, you can see a public data sharing arrangement in which a sharer has deposited information or data into a centralized repository, and requesters are able to get those data at their will. They don't have to apply for them. That's certainly a laudable type of data sharing that I've taken advantage of and hope to contribute to as well in various ways. Broadly available sharing is a type of data sharing which can be, in some instances, as open as is achievable ethically. And in that setting, sharers have put their data into a centralized repository. Requesters can apply to get the data, and a data access committee will judge those requests and approve them if it seems suitable. So also quite a relatively open form of sharing compared to the sharing arrangements I'll show you on the next slide. So there's a type of sharing that my colleagues and I have termed clique sharing. And essentially this is sharing between individuals who have some reason to want to help one another, and researchers who are not part of that clique are either unlikely or substantially less likely to be able to obtain access to those data. And then there's a very common sharing arrangement, which I believe is the one that actually I'll go beyond believe. when I review articles for journals, when I look at articles in my section of the world, far and away the most common arrangement for data sharing, if it's commented upon at all, is upon request. And in that setting, requesters are asking a sharer for the access to those data, and whether or not that happens is highly variable. Next slide, please. The limitations of those last two models, click sharing and the data available on request sharing, have to do with the difference between direct reciprocity and indirect reciprocity, I would say. If we think about this for a moment from an economic or anthropological perspective, when we enter into direct arrangements with people and we're asking them for data, that scales poorly because that data holding party's interests have to align with the data requesting party's interests to at least some extent. There has to be some mutuality of interest and for that to go forward. And there's really no reason to believe that aligned interests are an a priori requirement for excellent science to result from data reuse. So the data, give an example of an instance in which the data might be used to answer questions outside the zone of interest of the team generating the data. Take, for example, a team that does heart failure clinical trials. There may be a breast cancer researcher who thinks that there are data of value from the perspective of breast cancer research in that data set, but it may not be within the zone of interest of the investigators who are studying heart failure to worry about that, to take the time to enter into a one-off arrangement and to share those data. And so you run into problems of this type. Difficult or unreasonable conditions could also be placed on users of data. That's an important point as well. Next slide, please. Sharing data without the expectation of direct benefit can avoid these problems, but sharing of this type is unlikely to be a stable, frequent, popular option if there is no expectation of at least an indirect benefit. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is a look at the current state of data sharing as I see it. What is the desired future state? I would say less click, more click to download. So more public or broad sharing of data when that's ethically permissible. And next slide, please. Which brings us to a question, why do we need a metric? And on the left, what we can see, in other words, how would a metric help us get to that desired state of broader, more stable sharing? On the left, what you can see is a representation of how research in 2020 is very complicated and multiple groups will have input often in order to make a discovery. On the right, you can see what I think is the current state of affairs where the person who contributes data may not get much recognition for the fact that researchers have made a discovery in those data. And this can be a disincentive to sharing, I think. Next slide, please. Of course, on the left, what you can see is sort of a series of one-off agreements, negotiated agreements, data transfer agreements that people can make to try to share on terms that they find acceptable, which is one possible future state. But I would propose that the state described on the right is really what we should be aiming for. And it's a state in which the funding agency is considering the history or track record of sharing when deciding whom to fund. And I think that's the key point, and that's why we need a metric. Next slide, please. So a reputation for sharing must improve one's lot in life for sharing to be a popular option. For researchers, that can be reduced in practice to a better chance of getting funding. And researchers who judge funding applications may not know an applicant's personal reputation for sharing, so therefore a metric or maybe a judging rubric is required. Next slide, please. And I would assert that criteria can be devised that will identify and reward great sharers. I'm going to show you some case studies of great sharers that we identified for the purposes of rewarding them through the Research Symbiont Awards. Next slide. Dr. Morgan Ernest was a winner of the Research Symbiont Awards when she was nominated. She was an associate professor at the University of Florida. She had been openly sharing data in ecology, organismal traits, and life history of animals for over a decade. She published a data set that she had accumulated during grad school and as a postdoc. And it was published as a data paper, which has been cited more than 120 times, mostly for data reuse. And reuse of the data was found in papers published in Science, Nature, PNAS. She's also gone on to share additional data sets subsequently. And I would argue that that history of sharing should influence her chance of funding. Since it amplifies the impact of the research funding she's received, she will deliver a good return on investment. Next slide, please. This is Dr. Fabio Zanini, who at the time of nomination for a Research Symbiont Award was postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. Prior to that, he was at Max Planck, where he was studying the evolution of the HIV genome in untreated patients with HIV for time spans of up to 15 years. His group deep sequenced the virus and, of course, uploaded millions and millions of reads to SRA, but he felt that the data were insufficiently accessible for people who might want to reuse them. So he created a data portal, the URL's there. And next slide. And this is what the data portal looks like. It's truly beautiful. In fact, I hope you'll take a look at it. Next slide, please. This is another winner of the Research Symbiont Awards, Dr. Leonardo Cayoto Torres. He's a staff scientist at Johns Hopkins. He was the lead R developer for Recount 2. I imagine many of the people in the virtual room with me here, like I, have used this particular piece of software. And 46 publications had cited the paper describing this R package. And this is a URL for that package, the shiny version of that package. Next slide, please. This is Brian Bott. He is at Sage Bionetworks and made a data access portal for a study that he did along with colleagues at Sage Bionetworks of Parkinson's disease symptoms in the real world. He made the first 6 months of data available years before the manuscript was submitted for data analysis. Also, he paid great attention to the informed consent process, and study participants could choose whether they wanted to share their data only with the study team or more broadly with qualified researchers worldwide. Through a simple researcher qualification process, 229 researchers have gone through, people could gain access. Next slide, please. And this is Alex Linnale, who at the time of nomination for a Research Symbiont Award was a PhD student at MIT. He built a data portal to share data from 1,000 ALS patients with their permission. He had collected identically preprocessed and systematically harmonized approximately 400 terabytes of diverse biomolecular data, and that data portal is at the URL shown. So there are various ways that the success in data sharing that these people have had is demonstrated in these case studies, but we used a single set of criteria to identify all of these people. Next slide. Here are those criteria. Did the person create an openly shared scientific resource or data set beyond typical standards for their field? Was the sharing mechanism clearly permissible for all applicable legal and ethical restrictions? For example, was it covered in the informed consent document? Was the sharing mechanism as easy for people who wish to reuse the data as is feasible within ethical and legal constraints? Next slide. Was the data set remarkable for its richness, granularity, and quality such that it is inviting to people who wish to use the data? Is there evidence that a conflict of interest limits the data sharing? Were the data effectively reused to answer questions not addressed in an initial publication? And how clear is the publicly available audit trail of decisions potentially affecting people who wish to reuse the data? Next slide, please. So these criteria have been adapted for use by the Alex's Lemonade Stand Foundation. Their rubric for grant review includes a score 1 to 9 that includes essentially these same criteria. And you can look those up at the URLs listed here. Next slide. And how do they get the information to judge? They ask the applicants to who have submitted a grant application to justify how their data sharing has been used, not upon request, but what metrics would they like to offer, which I think is a smart way to do it. And note that they also cover protocol sharing and material and reagent sharing. Next slide. So a few more characteristics of a good sharing metric not incorporated specifically into the Research Symbiont rubric. It would be not limited to a particular type of artifact. It would include data, derivative models like machine learning models, code, transgenic animals, cell lines, and other unique reagents. People should be credited for their sharing, whatever the sharing is. Next slide. It should be hard to evade getting a history of either being cooperative or not being cooperative. If it's easy to hide a history of failure to cooperate, the metric will create problems. It should be persistent. Your reputation should stick with you. And it should be as objective as is possible. Now, if it's a rubric, there's going to be some subjectivity to it, and that may be as close as we can get to true objectivity. Next. It should be a low burden for research applicants and a low burden for study section members to make use of the information. And the Goodhart's law, we all know this, when a metric becomes a target, it ceases to be a good metric. The attack surface for that, how people will game the metric, should be understood as well as it can be. And I would challenge the community to help uncover the problems that are likely to arise with respect to that. Next slide. And then I finally want to just bring back to the point that a good use of a sharing metric, in my opinion, is to influence the probability of future funding. Just like Alex's Lemonade Stands Foundation is modeling, I think that's a very smart thing to do. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. That was both very thoughtful and very thought-provoking. And I think we all want to be good data sharers, and that's part of the reason that we're all participating in this workshop. So yes. I think we're gonna let me just double check. We have some questions for you in particular. Maybe have you answer one, and then we'll transition into the into the panel session.
Sure.
And I am just trying to scan through here.
Okay.
And folks, I didn't reiterate the instructions of include the speaker that you want to direct the question to.
Yeah.
In your question. Again, because we have a lot of questions here. I guess I have a quick one for you, and just thinking about the one, I think the Symbiote Awards start out as the Data Parasite Awards. Am I right about that?
Well, they started out as a conversation that was oriented around that. So Jeff Drayton and Dan Longo had written an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine in which they talked about data parasites or research parasites. And I think from some perspective, an economist would talk about sort of a free rider problem that they were sort of addressing obliquely. But this, of course, created a tremendous amount of backlash because people in the data analytics community have a skill set that they've developed over the course of many years, and they're very good at what they do, and they add unique value. And so the impression that they were somehow parasitic, of course, did not sit well with them, and I don't blame them in any way, shape, or form. So the discussion that I engaged with a number of people who are computational biologists was it might be important not only to give a black eye to those people who would hold on to the data, but also to reward those or recognize those who would share. And that's actually how it came about. But you're exactly right that it came about in the context of the Parasite Awards.
Great, thank you.